Hello, everybody. I've gotten a few requests to make a line graph construction tutorial in Microsoft Excel. So I'm going to take a few minutes to just walk everyone through that process to show you what it looks like. There are lots of different ways you can make your line graphs in Excel. I'm going to show you the way I do it. And to do it in a way that meets some of the graphing standards that we have been working on recently. What I'm going to do first is share my screen where I have some data already entered into Excel. And I'll talk a little bit about the data and how I typically like to arrange it. So you can see here in the Excel workbook, we have 4 different columns, each one corresponding to a different phase of our experimental design. So you can see we're working with a withdrawal design here, or an ABAB design, where we have our baseline phase, then our intervention phase, a withdrawal phase, and then a second intervention phase. So we're moving time through the columns here, baseline to intervention, withdrawal to the second intervention, and each row represents a different session. So you can see we have 5 baseline sessions in rows 2 through 6. Then we have 5 intervention sessions in rows 7 through 11, 5 withdrawal sessions in rows 12 through 16, and then 5 more intervention sessions in rows 17 through 21 for 20 total data points. These data are contrived. They're going to look really nice when we graph them. Things will not always look this nice, but this time I actually have control over what the data look like, so I decided to take some liberties with it. And so what we're going to do when we create a line graph, Excel has a function to create a graph. What we're going to start off by doing is highlighting all of the data in one big square like that. I'm going to leave out the phase headers because I don't think I like what Excel does with them if we were to tell it to make a graph with them included. So I'm just going to highlight those. I'm going to go up here and click on Insert Graph. And then I'll select this very first option. It's the 2D line graph where it allows for overlapping lines. So that's what we're going to pick almost every time. You can see they have some options with the markers already there. I would rather just start from scratch and put everything in myself. So I usually select this one. And you can see it plops in a graph there that is not terribly appealing from a visual standpoint. But the first thing I'm going to do is just blow it up so we can see what we're working with. And then after that, there are a few things I like to remove. The first of these horizontal lines running through each of our major y-axis tick points. So you can just click on those. They'll all get selected at once, and I'm going to hit delete. They're gone. The second thing I'm going to remove is the legend down here, Series 1, Series 2, Series 3. I'm just going to click on that and hit delete as well. You can see that gives us a little more space to work with. I'll also take off the chart title, hit delete on that. And now we're working with a much cleaner visual space than we had before, with kind of a lot of clutter in there. The next thing I'm going to do is look at my axes. So right now you may notice the text is really small. It's maybe not in a font that we like. If think about writing a manuscript in Times New Roman, a lot of times people will just drop these pre-constructed graphs in with the numbers in a different font, and it just doesn't look consistent. So we want to make that consistent. So let's just pretend we're using 12-point Times New Roman font. So we can click on the axis and then just change our font like we would with anything else. You can see that changes. We'll do the same with the x-axis label or text. Go to Times New Roman, make that 12 as well. So now that's starting to look consistent. Something that's maybe not so noticeable, we'll go back to each axis text. I think the font here may actually be a light gray, so I'm just going to click on it, and just to make sure, I'll go up here and change my font color. Yeah, you can see it's like a dark gray, actually very close to black, but it's not black, and so I'll make it black. You can see it darkens a little bit there. I'll do the same for the x-axis. Oops, not that one. And make that black as well. So that looks a little crisper against our white background. And so our axes there, at least the font of that text, looks pretty good. But you may notice we don't have a line running down our y-axis, and the line running across the x-axis is really faint. So we're going to do a few things just to make this a little clearer. And the way we do that, we can click on our axis, select all that, and then right click and go to Format Axis. And that's going to pull up a menu on the side here. One of the other first things we'll do while we're in here is to change our maximum down to 100. I didn't explain, but assume we're working with percentage data here, and these are percentage of intervals. So Excel, what it'll often do is set your y-axis some number of units above your highest data point, and you can see our very last intervention data point is 100. Excel doesn't want that to be hitting the very top of the graph, so it puts that range up to 120. Of course, with percentages, we don't usually operate in percentages of 120 intervals. That's not possible. So we're just going to set that to 100. And you can see that's looking a lot better. You'll also notice it changed the units down to units of 10. If we don't like that, we can just hop down to this next thing where it says units major and change that to something like 25 if we wanted it to look a little cleaner, maybe remove some of those numbers, or we could set it back to 10 if we wanted. Or really anything in between, as long as maybe they were equal intervals displayed. We wouldn't want it to be something maybe funky like 33, because then you get really wacky. So we're going to leave that, let's say, at 10. Let's just keep it there. So you can see 0 to 10 is displayed there. We're going to do the same for, well, actually, we're going to stay in here for a second. So you can see if I scroll down on the format axis options, there are tick marks, labels, and number. So what we're going to do first is click on tick marks. And let me minimize this because I can't see what I'm doing. OK, right now there's no line, there's no tick mark. So we're going to click on major type. And we're going to go outside, meaning the ticks are facing outside of the graphic display area, right? They're pointing towards the numbers, not inside. I'll show you what inside looks like. You can see the x-axis, the y-axis tick marks are now in the actual graph, which we don't want usually. So I'm going to leave those as outside. And then we can collapse that. I believe it's now made that blue, which is one of Excel's annoying defaults. It likes to make things blue and orange and gray and yellow. But when we're producing figures for publication, we typically make them black and white. So that's what we're going to go for here. So we can just click on the paint bucket here, still under axis options. That's going to control our coloring. And we can go to line here. So when we put those tick marks in there, it created a solid line. Before there was actually no line. And so I can click on no line. You see those tick marks go away. And if I were to unhighlight this axis, I'll click out here. Well, that wasn't helpful. There, you can see there's now no y-axis line there, and that's a problem. So we'll click back on our y-axis. We'll go back to the paint bucket. And we're still in line. We're going to hit solid line. And we're going to make it not blue. We'll make it black. So it's consistent. So we can click off of there, and now you can see our nice y-axis line running up from 0 to 100, and it's got those tick marks at each major interval facing outside of the graphic display area. And so we'll just do the same thing for the x-axis. We'll click on the x-axis, we'll hit the paint bucket. It says automatic right now, so it's that gray line. We're just going to tell it to make a solid line, and it already reverts to black because we changed our other one to black. We can do the tick marks here if we'd like. To do that, we'll just click back on, well, what will we click back on? Oh, it was there. The tick marks here under there's the axis options bar graph looking thing here. So we click on that. It had this axis options expanded. We can just collapse that and click on tick marks. If we want tick marks on our x-axis, it's a really similar dialog as we see on the y-axis, and we'll do outside. And so you can see that puts those tick marks down there on the x-axis as well. So now we have both of our axes pretty well formatted. I don't know that there's too much I would add here. Of course, we haven't added labels to those, and that's something I might do maybe at the very end or even after I drop this into like a Microsoft Word document. But for now, we like the way our axes are looking. The next thing we want to do is deal with these lines. They're all different colors. They don't have any markers on them. The one reason I sort my data like this, which with a different phase in each column, is that now Excel knows to treat each one as a separate data series. So I can click on the blue one there and you can see that's only baseline. I can click on the orange one, that's only my first intervention phase. My gray one, that's only my withdrawal phase, and my yellow one, that's my intervention phase. If I had lined all these data points up in a single column and just called it data, and then told it to make a graph, it would do that, but it would treat the entire data set as a single line. And so if I wanted to get these nice disconnections, that's something a lot of people struggle with. If I were to plot this out as a single data path, they would all be connected. And usually when we're displaying phase changes, we disconnect those data paths there. This saves you the trouble from having to do that. Although now I might be wondering if it would be helpful to show you how to do that. Maybe I can rearrange the data after we finish. But this is a way to just prevent having to do that step by sorting your data this way. And so the one step it maybe does add is that you have to format each data series separately. You can't just hit, change the data path altogether. But that's helpful sometimes if we want to use different markers across phases for whatever reason, or different line types. So it gives you a little more flexibility there. But again, you may have a different preference for how you want to handle this. So what we're going to do to each line is make them consistent. So I'll click on the first one, and then I'll right click and I'll hit Format Data Series. So that's this whole first phase. And I'll click on the paint bucket once that opens. And you can see we have a lot of options here to do with both the line and the marker. We're going to handle the line first. So it does this automatic business, which we don't like. We're going to tell it we want a solid line. It's going to revert to black because we've already been dealing with black lines before. So it's going to remember that we liked that. The first thing I change after that is this width. So right now it's at a pretty heavy weight, 2 1/4 point. We want to bring that way down. I actually like these to be as thin or maybe even 1 point thinner than our axes. So I'm just going to start going down, going down, going down. And that's maybe too thin. We'll go at a 1/2 point. So you can see it's a really faint line. It's thinner than our axis at this point. You could go up maybe one more. Now it's looking closer to our axis, but that's personal preference. We do whatever you prefer here. Maybe I'll leave it there. That actually looks nice. So we're going to go with a 1/4 point. After that, we can go to our marker. Now that we have a thinner black line, we're going to go to our marker. And you can see there's 3 different options. You can pick which marker you want, which shape, whether it's filled and whether it has a border. And you'll see Excel doesn't do anything very nicely here. I'm going to click on built in for the marker because it has a bunch of shapes already built in. I guess the classic would maybe be the filled in square. We could also do a circle, a triangle is popular, the diamond. These other ones I don't use as much. You can actually upload any image you want to use as a marker. And if I remember correctly, there is an article, and I forget which journal it is, that uses pizza slices as data points, which is really cool. But we're not going to do that today. We're going to stick with squares. And so I'm going to click off of here so you can see what this looks like. When I tell it to use the squares, if I were to maybe zoom in a little bit, you can see they're small and they're blue. Excel just loves to make these things blue. So we're going to click back on those. It'll select that whole data series. And we're going to click back on marker up here at the top. And we're going to tell Excel we want it to be filled, but we want it to be black, which it remembers. Nice. We just had to hit solid fill. And then we want the border to be a solid line, also black, which it will remember. So now we have our markers all in black, matching the rest of our graph so far. Some people like to make these a little bigger. The default size, I think, is 5. If you click on those, again, just to select them, click back on marker, and then collapse this, go to marker options. You can see there's a size button here. There's 6, there's 7. That looks pretty good. So now our markers clearly are standing out from the rest of the graph. They pop, right? That line is thin. If we hadn't made that line thinner, it would kind of blend in too much with the data points and they wouldn't pop as much. I like how prominent they are here. So that's the style I usually like. And all we're going to do now is do the same thing for these other lines. We'll go through each step. I'm not going to spend time describing it. I'm just going to keep doing it because the process is the same. I will take the line, make that smaller, go to the marker, 7, solid, solid. So you can see how quick that was once you kind of know what you're doing. Now it looks identical to our first phase. Going to do the same thing here. There's our third phase. Oh, I think I missed something there. The border did not get changed. And so you can always kind of step back and visually inspect to make sure things look consistent. So I see I had not changed the border there. Now it's looking consistent with the rest of them. We'll do the last one. There. So now all of our data sets, if we're considering them individual data sets, are consistent in their visual appearance. They have the same filled square marker. What we're missing now is a clear separation or a line that separates each of the data phases from each other. So, it's not enough to just disconnect this line. We usually like to insert a vertical line in between the phases to denote clear changes in our intervention procedures or whatever other changes we might be making. And to do that, you just have to draw a line. I clicked on Insert up here. I'm then going to click on Shapes. And you can see we have a bunch of shapes at our disposal, but we're just going to use this most simple line. And where we're going to place it, I like to click on the tick mark down here at the bottom on the x-axis that falls in between the two sessions during which we made the change, right? So session 5 was our last baseline phase data point. Session 6 is our first intervention data phase point, and we're going to use the tick mark in between those two to draw our line. So we're going to center our cursor right there on it, click and hold. Whoops, there we go. Click and hold and just drag it up. And drop it, I don't know, right about there. And so now we have a line that appears straight. It appears centered in between those two data points. You want to make sure there's equal spacing. We don't want to set it like over here, off-centered, or way the other way. We like it to be right in the middle. And of course, what did Excel do? It made it blue. I don't know why. I'm sure there are default settings I could change, but I don't know. I just never get around to it. Okay, so what I did was make it black there, right? Once I placed it, it opened up these options for me, and I just said, Excel, make it black. The other thing we usually do, instead of dropping a solid vertical line in here, we like to make it a dashed line. And you can see down here on the in the options for the line, there's a dash type, and you can just select that. Currently, it's on solid or no dash. The one I like is this long dash, which actually when you do it doesn't look so long. But that's the one I prefer. You could play around with it and find one that you like. And look, we can see it's just a little off center down there at the bottom. That may seem like a small thing, but it just kind of bugs me. So I'm going to click on it and just hit the left arrow key. That bumps it over like 1 pixel. Maybe we're still not aligned, so I'm going to do it one more time. There, perfect. So now you can see that dashed line is perfectly aligned with that tick mark. And just a tip to keep in mind, if you ever want to bump these lines around, you can click on it and use your arrow keys to move it the smallest distance it can possibly move if you're having trouble doing that with your mouse. It also, I don't know if that line is gray. No, it is black, but it's a very thin weight, so I might bump it up one. Now it's looking consistent with the rest of our lines that we have. And so just to show you what I did, it was looking a little faint, so I checked on it, and the width of it was smaller than all the other lines I have, so I just came here and bumped it up just 1 notch to 0.75, which is the same as our data path lines and our axes. So now it is looking good. Instead of drawing 2 more lines for our other phase changes, I'm going to click on this and just hit Command C or Control C if you're on a PC, and then Control or Command V to paste it. Now you can see it has a clone, which we're going to move, drop it approximately where we want it, click off to see how that looks. That looks good. That was a pretty good drop. So then we're going to click on that one, copy it, paste it again, and then drag this one over to where we want it to be. Click away from that one. Maybe is a little off center, so I'll click on it and bump it over to the right one. That one doesn't look great either. So we'll leave it right there. That looks fine. Perfection is sometimes difficult to achieve, but this is pretty close. So now what we have is a graph with our data paths all consistent and clean looking. We have those phase change lines in between. We have our axes formatted really nicely, reflecting the 0 to 100% range of our data. We don't want to go above that if we're dealing with percentage data. And if you're dealing with percentage data, you also often don't want to go below that. You want to reflect the full range of your possible data points there. The other thing we might want to do, it's not noticeable now, but around this whole graph is a gray border, which if you were to paste this into a Microsoft Word document, it would show up and not look like it's blending in so well with the Word document. So if you click just on like the outer space here, it'll select the whole graph. And there's a border option here. We can just hit no line, take that away. And you won't notice the change because it's highlighted, but if we just click into a cell to unselect it, you can see now those edges are kind of bleeding into the cells, right? That border is obviously gone. So that's how we're going to create the graphs. I think stylistically, that's everything we have to do. One other thing we need to think about when making these is formatting the axis lengths. If you're familiar with some of the work I've done with Keith Radley, we've talked a lot about this metric. It's DPP XYR, which is the data points per X to Y axis ratio. Not a very intuitive or easy to pronounce acronym, but that's what we're working with. And all that means is we want to make sure that the lengths of our axes, both of them, conform to a certain ratio, also dependent on the number of data points that you could fit within your graph based on the length of your x-axis. And that may sound confusing, but I'm going to walk us through it. So, you know, the older recommendations that we had would say things like, oh, set your axis length to a 3 to 5 ratio, right? Where the x-axis was you know, the 5 of the ratio and the y-axis length was the 3. So you might set it at 3 inches for y-axis and 5 inches for x-axis, or 6 inches for y-axis and 10 inches for x-axis. The math, you know, it's a ratio, so it's pretty easy to move that around. But those simple ratios don't account for the number of data points you could possibly fit onto your field, right? If we had room here, for example, for 50 data points, this 20 here would be squinched all the way over here. All this data would get squished up, and it wouldn't matter how we scaled these axes in terms of the ratio. The data would get squished, and that's what we're trying to avoid. So we've come up with this metric that incorporates both the number of data points you're trying to fit into this physical space and the ratio of each axis's length. And you know, I said the acronym wasn't intuitive. Well, the value we're trying to go for is not intuitive either. The kind of ideal DPP XYR value is 0.14 or larger. So if 0.14 doesn't sound too easy to remember, just remember 0.20 or even 0.5 if you wanted to. That's much larger than it needs to be, but it will maybe save you some headache in trying to remember that actual value. And so the way we calculate that, and maybe I can come over here and put the formula, we do the x-axis length divided by the y-axis length divided by the number of data points, not that you have plotted out, but the number of data points that could fit on your x-axis. So right now, those two are the same. We have 20 data points, and we could fit 20 data points. But remember, if I said this x-axis extended up to, let's say, 50, we would have 20 data points in maybe the first almost half of the graph. And then the other half would just be empty blank space. You see this a lot when people are graphing out multiple baseline panels, and maybe one panel has way more data points than the other panels, but they want all of their x-axes to remain consistent, and so they scale them all that way, and it squishes all their data and leaves a lot of blank space, but they want to keep those x-axes consistent. And so for that reason, we're using the number of data points that could fit, not the number of data points that are fit. Hopefully that makes sense. And so what we're going to do is a little math. So I said if we were to calculate DPP XYR, we're going to use a formula here. And we're going to tell Excel our DPP XYR equals this number divided by this number divided by this number. That's DPP XYR. And right now there's nothing in there, so it's not going to work. But We need to get a measure of both our x-axis and our y-axis to be able to compute this. We know what the data points are, right? We can put that in. It's 20. Remember, that's how many we can fit. You can see it's up to 20 down there on our x-axis. So we're going to put that in. Now we need a measure of our x and y-axis. And so if you're on a Mac, Command-Shift-4 will get you the screenshot tool, which is what we're going to use to do this. If you're on a PC and using Windows, I'm not certain that there's a screenshot tool that gives you the measurements. You can see on the Mac, I'm hoping you can see my cursor. There are some numbers that will follow my cursor around. Those are the pixels, the number of pixels. So you can see if I move just 1 pixel left, that 602 went down to 601. And so that's what we're going to be getting a measure of. It doesn't matter what unit that you measure your axes in. You know, you could be holding up a ruler to your screen and measuring this in inches or centimeters and using that. But I find the pixel measurement just much more precise because it varies at a much smaller unit. And so we're going to get a measure of our x-axis and our y-axis in pixels. If you're on a Windows PC, I think Google Chrome has a ruler extension which you can use to measure things. We've used that before. But if you're on a Mac, the screenshot tool, Command-Shift-4 works really well. And I'm going to place my cursor up here at the very top of the y-axis. And I'm going to click and drag all the way down to the very end of my x-axis. And so you can see the gray area that's highlighted here is the whole field, right? It's got the length of my x-axis down at the bottom, the height of my y-axis from top to bottom, and the two values here next to my cursor are the length in pixels of the x and the y-axis respectively. So it's 805 for the x-axis and 372 for the y-axis. So if I come over here and put 805 and 372, now we have our dppxyr calculated, right? It's the x-axis divided by the y-axis, and then you just divide that by the number of data points. It's not a complicated formula, but that's what we get. It's a ratio that also incorporates the number of data points you could fit within that field. And you can see here, our dppxyr is smaller than 0.14. It's 0.10. And so that is not ideal. We want to get that number up by about 0.04, which isn't terrible. And so what we can do, there are a number of ways we can do this, right? We could shrink our y-axis, or we could lengthen our x-axis. Which one you choose is up to you. Let me just shrink the y-axis a little bit. The way we do this is click on our graph and just grab the top of it and shrink it down a little bit. There, that's looking better. Although you can see, look what didn't move, our lines, our phase change lines. Before I adjust those though, I'm gonna remeasure and make sure I'm done manipulating my dppxyr before I go and move those lines. So now we're at, so our x-axis should not have changed. We're looking at 805 and 295. So I'm going to come over here. So 805 remains the same, but now we're down to 295. Ooh, 0.136. We could round up and say that's 0.14, but I'm going to try and get it a little closer there. So you can see I shrunk it down some. Going to remeasure one more time. 285 is now the y-axis. Let's see if that works. We shaved a little off the top. Perfect. So we're at 0.1412, which is greater than 0.14. So that's going to be a good dppxyr for us. That's going to minimally distort our data. We don't want to have anyone looking at these data and coming to a conclusion that isn't accurate. And so based on some of the work we've done, that's the value we feel like will yield the most conservative judgments. It will not inflate your treatment effect sizes. But you can see I'm working with really nice looking data. So that's not so much a concern. But if your data were questionable or had maybe a small effect size, it would be possible to magnify that effect size by manipulating the dppxyr. And that's what we want to avoid. So with that done, you can see I just dragged the top of those phase change lines down. We could say this graph is pretty much finished. This one is ready to go. You know, if I wanted to, I could insert a text box. I could go to Insert Shapes, click on Text Box, and just drag one in there and type in something like baseline. You can see we're back in Calibri and 11-point font, so I'm going to change that. bump that up to 12. I'll center the text box. And you can see Excel puts a border around it. So we'll click on it. Oop, not that. We'll click on the text box and hit no line. That removes that line. And so then we can click on it now that we have it formatted the way we want, Command C or Control C, and then Command V or Control V, and just drag that over. Excel will sometimes give you guidelines to show you if you're even with the previous one, but we'll just try to eyeball it. Baseline, intervention, paste another one. We'll call this withdrawal. And whoops, didn't want to do that. And our last phase, we're kind of running into our data here, but that's fine. We'll see how this works. Intervention, maybe call it intervention 2. And you can see here, Excel has, overwritten our data, which is not good. That's because this text box is filled in, but watch what we can do. We can click on it and tell Excel no fill, and there, now it's transparent. So that is our graph. I think then we are done. I mentioned the labels for the sessions and the y-axis. I had mentioned doing that in Word when you paste it in, simply because right now we don't have the white space below or next to the axes to do that. We could shrink this whole graph down to create it, but I don't want to do that. I usually just add it in after the fact. So there it is. There is your withdrawal graph making tutorial in Excel, taking you from what it looked like in the beginning to something I feel comfortable dropping in a manuscript and sending it off. So hopefully that was helpful. Hopefully I didn't move too quickly and explained everything. But if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to me. I do this stuff on a daily basis and love talking about graph production. So hope you find this helpful. Have a good evening.